Red Cave Podcast. Reading tonight from Tales from the Cracks, numbers 45 through 47. Starting with Bloody Mary, You Have My Child, followed by The Loose Ends, and concluded with It Came Out of the Sky. I went by the druid stone that broods in the garden white and lone, and I stopped and looked at the shifting shadows that at some moments fall thereon. From the tree hard by with a rhythmic swing, and they shaped in my imagining to the shade that a well-known head and shoulders threw there when she was gardening. I thought her behind my back, yea, her I long had learned to lack, and I said, I am sure you are standing behind me. Though how do you get into this old track? And there was no sound but the fall of a leaf. As a sad response, and to keep down grief, I would not turn my head to discover that there was nothing in my belief. Yet I wanted to look and see that nobody stood at the back of me, but I thought once more, nay, I'll not unvision a shape which, somehow, there may be. So I went on softly from the glade, and left her behind me throwing her shade, as she were indeed an apparition, my head unturned lest my dream should fade. Thomas Hardy. Bloody Mary, You Have My Child. When Jonie awoke, it was 9:58. She looked over at her digital clock. She jumped up from her bed and ran out of her room, stopping at the bathroom. She opened the door and carefully edged for the light switch. She expected a cold, clammy hand to wrap around hers, then pull her in. She found the switch and flipped it. The bathroom was in tip-top shape. Everything was in the order her mother had put it in. She took out a bobby pin that would aid in her plan. She reached for the doorknob and locked it from the outside. The alarm clock setting on the counter turned to 10 o'clock. She had to hurry. She took the bobby pin out of the lock. Jonie closed the door and headed for her room. But what seemed like 10 seconds after closing that door, she heard the cracking of glass and the small thump of footsteps on the linoleum. Once Jonie reached the door to her bedroom, she looked back. The doorknob was rattling back and forth. She felt fear wash over her like a bucket of ice-cold water. She had to get out of the house, but found it was too late. A long, bony finger with a sharp yellow nail protruded from the keyhole and twisted sideways with a small click. The finger recoiled and the door started to open slowly. Jonie ran into her room and slammed the door behind her. She put her back to it, eyes closed, praying soundlessly. Outside, she could hear the soft creaking of the carpet. It was corrupting. Jonie could hardly breathe. She knew it was coming, she knew. Then the footsteps ceased. The doorknob shook, but Jonie had the handle on it. There was a tenuous push on the door again, but Jonie still had her broad shoulder propped up against it. This time the door was hit with strong force that caused Jonie to step back a bit, but that made her push harder against the door. It came again, only stronger. This time the door even opened, introducing a wicked, rotting odor. Jonie pushed back, slamming the door. She started to cry, tears rolling down her cheeks. She needed something to prop up against it. She looked over to see her computer chair close to her flexing foot. She slid her foot under the bottom of it and dragged it closer. The door flung open again, but Jonie just pushed back, closing it again. She grabbed the chair with her free hand and pushed it under the doorknob. She made sure it was secure before jumping back onto her bed, but the chair held the door in place. She looked over at her digital clock. It was 10:04. Just one more minute. She looked at the carpet. Blood, streamers of it, were seeping under the crack. The chair was rocking back and forth and blood was dripping out from the keyhole. Then the digital clock turned to 10:05. Jonie looked back at the door, but there was no more movement. She could distinctly hear someone step into the bathroom. Then the door slammed, the lock clicking. She put her face into her hands. This was going to happen every night. But how could she keep doing this? She lay face down on her bed, struggling with a breath that threatened not to come. A week later, Jonie snuck out of her house and went to the park. It was 9:39, and soon she would be visited again. Jonie sat down in a swing, her head in her hands. 10:05, Mary checked her own watch, her arm shaking slightly. Nothing happened. Okay, I can go home now, Jonie said shakily. They both got up and started to their homes. In the pure darkness, Mary could see Jonie's pale white skin. It was milky, and it made Mary's skin tingle. It was like sharing the sidewalk with a ghost. Then Mary reached the street corner that would lead to her house, but Jonie grabbed her arm. Mary wished she hadn't because the grass was icy and felt like rubber. She hadn't cut her nails for a while, and they were digging into Mary's skin. Walk me to my house? She asked. Mary and Jonie made their way to Jonie's house, which was on the opposite corner. Mary looked over at her. She was literally quaking with cold mixed with fear. If Jonie was telling the truth, she was truly in hell. Then sirens broke the awkward silence, followed by a plume of smoke that covered the sky. Then there were yells of desperate and frantic men. Jonie and Mary exchanged worried looks before Jonie took off in a stumbling sprint. "Jonie!" Mary yelled, running after her, slippers flipping away from her feet. Rocks, bits of gravel, and what seemed like a rusty nail cut through her feet. Mary squinged in pain, but kept running until she was around the bend to see Jonie's house at the end of the corner, or what was left of Jonie's house. It was swallowed in flames, firemen trying their best to keep the inferno down. Jonie was running toward the house, yelling frantically, but 2 firemen grabbed her by each arm and held her down. Jonie fought back, tears flooding out of her open eyes. Mandy stepped into her freshly painted house, slipping off her backpack. "I'm home," she called, but her mom was most likely working and her dad was probably out on an important meeting. She sat down on the couch, not bothering to do her homework. She was too preoccupied with all that was happening. Mandy turned on her TV and started to stare into it, getting lost. TV always helped her with things that troubled her. Also, Jonie helped with those kinds of things, but Jonie seemed like she needed a little help too. Mandy lunged for the phone, but then thought she wouldn't be at Mary's yet. She didn't even know where Mary lived. She huffed a sigh of disappointment. Mandy slouched into her chair, waiting for a phone call. "Come on, Mary, don't keep me waiting like this," she thought to herself. Jonie was her best friend of all these years. She did not believe in ghosts or any kind of supernatural things, but there was something about the way Jonie was behaving the past few days. She had been through a lot. All of a sudden, a dark figure passed through the room, which made her screech out in horror. Jonie was lying on the floor in front of her, with a knife driven into her head. Then the phone rang and Mandy bolted out of her sleep. It was nighttime and a blanket was wrapped around her. Mandy snatched the phone and set it to her ear. "Hello?" she said sourly into the phone. "Mandy, turn your clock to 10, Jonie's voice said on the other side. "Why?" "So I can come to get you. All of you, especially Jonie. You'll all fall into temptation." It was a woman's voice now. Then blood spurted out of the phone, drenching her. She burst up from her couch, sleep still on her, when she hit the ground. She then snapped her eyes open. It was just a dream. She was on the floor, breathing hard. Just a dream. The clock on the wall said it was 5:42, so she had been sleeping for some time. Her parents still weren't home, but she wasn't worried about that. They usually came home around 6. Still, Mary hadn't even called, and Mandy was worried about that. Mandy went into the kitchen to find the butcher knife lying neatly on the kitchen counter. That hadn't been like that a few hours ago, or had it? Mandy walked quickly out of the kitchen and slowly went into the bathroom. She ran the water, cupping her hands, and she caught a pool of it to slosh on her face. Then she leaned over the sink. She looked up to see her crisp reflection in the wall-high mirror. She wiped her face and fixed her hair in front of it. She went to leave when something made her stop and look back into the mirror. She remembered Jonie's party, where Jonie had said the chant in front of the mirror. No Bloody Mary, she said, smiling. Mandy frowned. She touched the mirror thoughtfully. She then closed the door and locked it. Mandy put her finger to the light switch for a second, still looking at her shuddering reflection. Then the bathroom went black. Mandy stared blindly into the darkness, trying to calm down. She let out a little frightened squeak before reciting the chant. When she was finished, she added, "Bloody Mary, I have your child." By then, she was bolder and sure that she was safe. Darkness, silence. Nothing was happening. She let out a low, relieved sigh before reaching for the light switch. Crack, crack. Mandy's hand stopped in midair, her head pounding. The mirror was cracking. Mandy leapt for the door, but she couldn't go any farther than a slight shuffle. She started to panic. Then Mandy froze, eyes fixed on the darkened mirror. A blue woman, dressed in a long robe, stood behind a slightly illuminated Mandy. The woman was covered in pouring blood. Her eyes were white, and her mouth was twisted in a horrid frown. Mandy started to moan as a hand rose up and rested on her shoulder. Nails sunk down into her skin. Then she was thrust backward, and she was slashed across the spine with a long bladed cane. Mandy's body writhed back and forth as she was slashed and stabbed. Mandy was still screaming until the butt of the cane came down into her mouth, knocking out all her front teeth. The glowing woman frowned throughout the whole process, eyes never leaving Mandy. The blade of the scepter was thrust into Mandy's intestines, causing a streamer of blood to squirt across the bathroom wall. Mandy then was thrust forward, face first into the floor, smashing the top of her skull, and then Bloody Mary picked the semi-dead Mandy up by the collar and dropped her backward onto the bathroom counter. Her head smashed into the mirror, finishing her off. Her eyes rolled back and her head lolled to the side. Then Bloody Mary was simply gone, leaving a blood-stained bathroom and a bleeding corpse to go with it. All this happened in 30 seconds. Then the phone started to ring and ring until it got the voicemail. "Hi, Mandy, I guess I called at the wrong time. Jonie's okay, she's right here. We had a bit of a scare, but no big deal. Okay, I'll call back. Bye," said Mary. Right at that very second, Mandy's parents walked in the house together. "Well, she didn't pick up," Mary said, turning towards Jonie, who was curled up in Mary's bed. They were both in Mary's room. both counting down to 10 o'clock. Mary was sitting at her desk right in front of a huge mirror. Jonie was looking at the mirror, watching her reflection, her withering, dying one. "Jonie, did you hurt yourself when you fainted?" Mary asked worriedly. "No," Jonie said. "My dad's really worried," Mary said. "Lose the mirror," Jonie replied. "What?" "I can't sleep in this room. It has a mirror." Mary looked back at it. She could see Jonie shuddering in the glass. She was convinced that Bloody Mary was tearing her world apart. "Well, when our guest room's ready, you can sleep down there," Mary replied, looking back over at Jonie. "4 more hours," Jonie said, ignoring Mary completely. Mary sat back, secretly wanting Bloody Mary to take her away from all this complication, yet Jonie too was wishing the same thing. Mary left to go to the bathroom, and when she got back to the room, she turned the knob savagely. Locked. Mary twisted the knob again and again. "Jonie, come on, let me in," Mary yelled. No response. Mary slammed against the door, yelling for Jonie to open. "Is everything okay?" Mr. Jacobs yelled up at Mary. "Yes, fine," Mary lied. Mary turned back to the door and bent down to look through the keyhole. Mary gasped. The room was in a mess. Jonie was against the opposite wall of the mirror, writhing around like she was being slapped. The mirror was pouring down blood, flooding a river of red over Mary's white carpet. Mary extracted a pin from her hair and stuck it into the lock. She turned and spun it around until she heard a click. She swung open the door and gasped again. Jonie was lying in the corner, shivering fiercely. The room was in perfect order, and the mirror was back to its clean self. The carpet was no longer bloodstained. Mary, she somehow got through the mirror. She will kill me if I sleep in here," Jonie stuttered. I just saw this room and you being torn apart. What do you mean?" Mary said, running towards Jonie to help. "She came out. She would have killed me. Her eyes," Jonie sobbed. Mary led Jonie out of the room, trying to ignore the freezing temperature. Mary and Jonie sat down in her sister Katie's room to talk, but Jonie just rolled over to her side. Mary got up and put a blanket around Jonie's shoulders. But her friend didn't close her eyes, not even to blink. Mary passed her room but closed the door, still thinking of the room she saw through the keyhole. She didn't even think she could sleep in it anymore. She didn't want to leave Jonie alone, so she went into the computer room right next to Katie's room. She turned on the computer to play some solitaire. She couldn't stop thinking of Mandy and the way she looked at Mary before she walked home. Mary had even promised to Mandy she would call her. Mary thought that maybe if she had called just a few minutes earlier, Mandy might still be alive. Mary leaned back in her chair. In the room alone, Jonie spoke to herself. "It's the reflection in the mirror. It's the blood on the glass." Jonie's body twitched suddenly from Katie's bedroom floor, foam starting to drop from her chin. 9 o'clock, Jonie said, right as the clock in Katie's room turned to 9. That night, Mary fell asleep in the computer room, and Jonie was absent from Katie's bedroom floor. Come to think of it, Mary's father didn't even think twice as to why Jonie spent every night locked in the basement from 10 to waking hours. He was a little worried why he would find a new crack in the bathroom mirror each night. Mary herself was sleeping down on the couch instead of her room all that week. She kept thinking of what Jonie had said about Bloody Mary in her bedroom mirror. Mary's father was worried of that as well. Jonie, though, slept down in the basement, the door locked. Sleep was not the right word, though. She would just huddle in the corner, eyes wide and glassy. When she rarely did fall asleep, she would dream of Mandy being thrown into a shattering mirror by a blood-stained arm. Jonie would then wake up in a cold sweat, only to get up to get ready for another day, even if it was 1 o'clock in the morning. Then Mary would wake up to her alarm clock to find a pale Jonie, dressed in her regular clothes and backpack, staring down at her. "Good morning, Mary," Jonie would say coolly every morning. "Ready for the day to come?" The next 2 weeks were horrible for Mary and Jonie. Night after night, as Mary slept on the couch, she could feel a cold draft pass by her huddled figure. She would always wrap her blanket over her head and try not to breathe hard. Mary would even hear footsteps pass right by the couch and down the hall. This would always happen at 10 o'clock. Mary would then listen intently as the basement door down the hall rattled and banged around. This is, of course, where Jonie slept each night. The door would just keep rattling silently at first, and then to a point where Mary thought her family would wake up. They never did, though. Some nights, Mary just wanted to jump up and run, but she had no idea of what the outcome would be. Right when Mary thought she was about to go mad, the rattling would stop and the cold breeze rushed by again. Sometimes Mary would hear the patter of blood on the carpet or the heavy wheezing of something. It was always 10:05. When Mary finally did wake up from her horrific nightmares, she would find no blood on the carpet, but there would always be a pale Jonie waiting for her. The girls weren't doing so well either. They were all mourning the death of Mandy. They couldn't understand how Jonie showed no emotion or compassion for Mandy. Jonie would just sit silently in class, staring at the blackboard and whispering under her breath. The girls were also worried for Mary because, just like Jonie, she wasn't getting too much sleep and was becoming incredibly silent. Mary was also falling asleep a lot during class, which always led her straight to the principal's office. Her father was disappointed and worried. Mary was usually such a good girl, but she had been going through a lot, yet he really didn't have any idea. The loose ends. Stanley, Eric, and Freddie, middle-aged, stand in a perfect triangle inside an abandoned warehouse. The only light that is cast is from a camping lantern setting atop a small table. Stanley: "You guys are ganging up on me." Freddie: "I'm sorry if this is a surprise." Stanley: "Well, it is. I don't know what to say. When we spoke last week, you boys were both on board. What the hell happened?" Freddie: "Me and Eric got to talking. There's too much at stake here. We feel like there's some loose ends that we can't ignore." Stanley: "Well then, let's get this out in the air, shall we?" He crosses his arms. His suede jacket rises above his midriff, revealing the butt of his pistol, tucked into the waistband of his jeans. "Let's knot up all those loose ends, right, boys?" Freddie: "Well, the problem is..." Eric: "We don't want to kill the guard, all right? It's not necessary." Stanley: "So here lies the problem. Murder. Your consciences can't deal with that ugly, ugly word. Is that right?" Both men nod. Stanley continued: "Let me put it this way, boys. When we hit the cemetery on Monday night, the only thing standing between us and our treasure is the watchman. The only way to make sure he doesn't talk is if we bury him along with my uncle." Freddie: "I don't see why we can't knock him out and tie him up." Stanley: "Okay, apparently you haven't been listening to me. If we tied the guy up, the next morning he'd tell the cops a group of men with shovels roughed him up and entered the graveyard. Then we'd have pigs snooping around the place, and they'd find footprints, shit like that. Somehow all signs would point to my uncle, and then I'd have police knocking on my door. Anyone with real cause to take the family treasure would be someone from his own family." Eric: "But if we made sure there was no sign your uncle's grave was disturbed, the police shouldn't come looking for you." Stanley: "You don't get it." He closes his eyes and clenches his fists. "The sheer idea is that men with shovels entered a boneyard. What does that mean? Grave robbers. Police will eat that up. The cemetery knows a man was just buried with a variety of expensive trinkets, and all they need is the man's gravestone to record his name. Then they'll go from there." Freddie: "You're going about this the wrong way. We should sneak into the cemetery without even worrying about the guard. I bet that fucker sleeps the whole night anyway." Stanley: "And be looking over our shoulders all night?" Freddie: "It's just an idea. That's what we're doing here. We're coming up with, I don't know, alternatives." Stanley: "Do you realize how much thought I put into this plan? My uncle was buried a month ago this Friday, and we're set to dig next Monday. Even before I called you, I had this all charted point for point, and I'm not going to change it just because you boys are having a panic attack. Do you know how long I've been waiting to get my hands on these heirlooms?" Freddie: "Yes, your entire life. Ever since I've known you, your great-grandfather's pocket watch was all you ever talked about." Eric: "And his war medals?" Stanley: "They were supposed to be mine. As the last descendant of the White family line, I deserve them. My uncle was a selfish man, and even now as he begins to stink, he is a selfish man." Eric: "What's more selfish than selling your family heirlooms to some pawn shop?" Stanley: "Fuck you! From now on, Freddie speaks for you. We're the ones talking, and you're just here to look pretty." Eric: "Hey man, I'm just trying to help you. You needed an extra man to dig a grave, and here I am. I think..." Stanley: "I don't give a shit what you think. This is my plan here, and it's perfect just as it is. I was the one that met with the collector down in Longshore and had my family treasure valued. If you boys want that 800 grand split 3 ways, you will do things my way." Eric: "Bullshit. You need us and you know it. It'll take all night if you dig that grave alone." Stanley: "If you talk again, it'll be your body I push into that grave." Eric: "Kiss my..." Freddie: "Just breathe here, please. He's only trying to help. We've known each other a long time, Stan. You can trust that I chose Eric for a reason. How many jobs have we done together, huh? We're petty thieves, that's all we've ever been. All we're good at is cracking safes. To put money before a human life it's meaningless." Stanley: "Answer me this. When was the last time we worked together? 10 years? Changed a lot since then." Freddie: "I'm sorry you feel that way." Stanley: "I'm not. I'm thinking logically here. This way no one has to know. We kill the poor slug and then he gets buried in the same grave we have to fill anyway. It's flawless. Think about it." Freddie: "Listen to you. Kill the poor slug and no one has to know? You haven't killed a wild animal, let alone a human being. What makes you think you can do it?" Stanley whips out his weapon and points it into Freddie's face. Freddie backs up against the wall, palms out. Eric: "For God's sake, he's your friend." Stanley whirls around to point the gun at Eric, who ducks to the floor, huddling against the wall and hiding his face in his hands. Freddie: "Stan, please!" Stanley: I tell you to bring someone trustworthy into this job and this is who you choose? Look at him, cowering like a child. Freddy, you're pointing a gun at him. Stanley, he's the reason why you're backing out, isn't he? He swayed you, made you soft. Freddy, so, you're gonna kill us? Is that it? Stanley. Stanley cocks the gun and Eric whimpers through his fingers. Well, no, I forgot to load it. He lowers his weapon, walks to the door, opens it, and turns around before stepping outside. I'm better than you. Freddy. Yeah, I bet. It's gotta be nice to have no principle. Stanley. Are you kidding? It's great. Just look at you, teetering on your feet, and look at your disgusting pet on the floor. He would love to tear my throat out, I know. I, on the other hand, wouldn't waste a bullet on either one of you. Freddy. Who are you? Stanley. I'm your friend, you asshole. Sure. Even though you stabbed me in the back, I've learned a lot in these 10 years. I learned how to calm myself by clenching my fists. I'm better than you because I can make a fist and regulate my heartbeat. I can remain calm and even smile. He shows off his yellow teeth. My hands are not weapons. A real weapon can clean out a person's skull. Freddy. I feel sorry for you. Stanley. Don't. We're all going to hell. The door cracks open and light fills the room. Then Stanley is gone. The door closes behind him. Eric. Eric regains his feet with the help of Freddy. Good lord. Where'd you meet that psycho? Freddy. Elementary school? Eric. You're kidding me. Freddy. No. Eric. Alright. Now for plan B. We're doing things my way now. Freddy. Can't say we didn't try. Eric. There's no convincing a psychopath. I told you we'd be wasting our breath. Freddy. But we have a history. I thought if anyone could change his mind, it was me. Eric. And you tried, but he had the gun. Maybe that's where we went wrong. If you want to convince someone, you buy a gun. Freddy. What do you think he'll do when he turns on the news tomorrow morning and sees that we beat him to the punch? You know the guard is going to talk. Eric. He'll come after us. Freddy. He won't find us, right? Is it even worth it? Eric. 800 grand? Are you kidding? Freddy. No. For the sake of that poor watchman. If we don't go to that graveyard tonight, Stanley will kill him next Monday. Eric. So is it better that we die in his place? Freddy. I don't know. Eric. Sounds like we got the sour end of the deal. I don't know about you, but I'm headed straight to Canada with my cut. Freddy. We should probably get going if we gotta get to the graveyard by nightfall. We need to get dark clothing, masks, flashlight, rope, don't forget the chloroform, and the shovels, of course. Eric. No, I thought ahead. The shovels are in my car right now. Freddy. Your car? Eric. Yeah, my car. Freddy. Did you cover them up, put them in a bag, or just throw them in your trunk? Eric. No, they're in my back seat. Why? Freddy. Did you hear Stanley's car at all? Eric. Actually, I didn't. You don't think he saw them, would he assume? They both stare soundlessly at the closed door. Freddy. How long does it take to load a gun? Eric. Shit. Freddy. Will he come back in here or wait for us to come out? Eric. You're the one who's known him since elementary school. Freddy. And still I can't say. All I know is that my life is flashing before my eyes. Do you feel that too? Have you ever heard your heart beat that clearly before? Eric. And all because of a couple shovels. It isn't fair. Freddy. I think I can hear those bullets clicking into the chambers, one by one. Then they both hear Stanley's engine roar into life outside the warehouse. They listen as the noise slowly ebbs away into nothing. Eric. I think I'll stay home tonight. Freddy. I was thinking the same thing. Eric. And the watchman? Freddy. God help him. They both make their way toward the exit, and Freddy stops to pick up the camping lantern. Before Eric even has a chance to open the door, Freddy switches off the light. End scene. It came out of the sky. As silent as the desert night had proven to be in those handful of moments after the sunset, Eric wasn't the least bit surprised to hear the crunching footsteps on the trail behind him and catch a glimpse of the cell phone flashlight as it shined its guiding light out of the cover of bramble bushes and into the makeshift, man-made campsite Eric had laid claim to. He knew that his own campfire served as a lighthouse to his arriving friend Travis, who materialized out of the darkness with his light and chose the seat on the fallen log beside Eric without a word, pocketing his flashlight and withdrawing a cigarette in the same movement. Those were some good tunes you were listening to on your way down the mountain, Eric commented, finishing off his own cig and tossing the butt into the crackling flames. I wondered why you turned it off so far from the campsite. Travis did not respond and proceeded to breathe heavily, breaking out into a coughing fit at the first drag of his cigarette. And you've been rushing to get here? Jogging even? Since when have you ever broken a sweat if you could help it? Eric asked, studying the crawling shadows on his friend's plaster face. On any normal camping trip, this would have been your 12th cigarette break on your way down the mountain. I wasn't expecting you for another 20 minutes. Just drop it, alright? Travis shot back. Why'd you turn off the music? How many times have you ruined the perfect quiet of the outdoors like this with your death metal music? To what do I owe this golden silence? If you like the quiet so much, then why are you talking now? Travis huffed. Seriously, something's up. Eric stood up and squared himself in front of his friend. Did you bring the fireworks? I brought the guns. Please tell me you didn't forget them in the car and that's why you're acting so spineless. Travis whipped the pack off his back and tossed it to his high school friend's feet. They're all in there. Eric didn't waste a moment in hungrily leafing through the contents and spreading out the explosives in the sand, dangerously close to the fire pit. So what should we fire off first? The guns or these? Eric pressed on. Can we just sit here a minute so I can catch my breath? Damn! Travis snapped. Seriously, what the hell happened to you on your way down the mountain? We must have hiked these trails a million times together, at later hours than this. We're in the middle of nowhere, in the Arizona desert. It's hardly hospitable enough for a rat to come biting on that tail you've tucked between your legs. You didn't hear what I heard on the trail, Travis roared back, which caused his voice to come bouncing back to them from the surrounding hills in an eerie echo that left them both silent for a handful of heartbeats. So you admit you're craving about something you heard in the trees, Eric finally scoffed, returning to his chore of sorting through their goods with his back turned. Let me guess, an owl blinked its big eyes at you and swooped low over your head. He probably hates your sorry excuse for music as much as I do. It wasn't what I heard, but what I saw. What I felt, Travis growled. You weren't there. You didn't feel how dead the trail felt. How everything froze like I'd entered a painting or something. People talk about that feeling of being watched, but it's real. There's no describing it. But it's like there's a magnifying glass above your head and you're the insect. Eric barked laughter. What are you going on about? I never took you for such a pussy. There was something behind the tree, watching me, Travis roared back, standing up to kick dirt in Eric's general direction. I had the music on my phone turned all the way up, but I stepped into a pocket of static. I don't know how to describe it. It felt like a vacuum, and all the matter was being sucked out of the air around me. And people say that they know when someone's watching them, and when they look behind them, there's the guy staring. That's what happened. I looked to my left, out of instinct or some shit, and I saw the thing peeking out from behind a tree. When I pointed my flashlight at it, I saw its big bug eyes light up like reflectors, and it slinked back behind the tree. Eric finally turned to look up at his friend, but he hadn't lost his smile quite yet. Okay, so you saw something with eyes. The number of things that fall into that category could fill a dictionary. So what? It was something upright. It had bony shoulders, and the hands were like claws. It wasn't human, I'm telling you. My flashlight was on it, but its skin stayed black. It almost seemed to swallow all light that touched it, except for its eyes. Man, I'm telling you, the trees in the dark, especially with shadows kicked up by a flashlight, can start playing tricks with your eyes, Eric continued. I don't think you should be so worked up over some shadow thing in the night. It could have been an optical illusion. No! You weren't there. You didn't see it. I'm sorry I said anything. Travis sat down hard on the log, but he wasn't facing the fire. He was looking back the way he'd come, at the entrance to the hiking trail, and he was holding one of Eric's revolvers in his hands, which he'd grabbed from Eric's gear. If it'll make you feel any better, we'll both go up the trail with my lanterns, and we'll both have guns. Eric punctuated this statement by cocking the hammer back on his own .44 Magnum. Whatever creeper you saw in the trees won't stand a chance, and at best we'll come back tired and hungry. And hey, if we do bag a Bigfoot, then we'll be pioneers of the scientific community. Stop fucking around. This thing was in my head. Don't you get it? Travis snapped. It can infect the environment it's in. Get under your skin and make you feel its anger. It wasn't happy I was blasting that music. It hated I was there. And that was a warning. What do you think it'll do when I go tromping back up into its domain with a friend and weapons? You're giving this coyote way more credit than it deserves, Eric said. Coyote? Did you hear what I just said? It was standing upright. What the fuck is that? Eric followed the direction of Travis's pointing hand, surprisingly away from the hills behind them and up into the night sky. Eric glanced briefly up at the twinkling diamond-encrusted dome above his head and then retraced the line back to Travis's shaking arm, still upraised. What? What am I supposed to be looking at? I swear, if this is your idea of it, shut the fuck up and look! Travis burst up and pointed his gun into the sliver of sky that was troubling him, and Eric was able to pick out a star brighter than all the rest, blinking and strobing, much more prominently than its neighbors, but still in the characteristic wheelhouse of a star. Can you feel that? It's the vacuum I felt on the trail. It's sucking the air out of my lungs, tapping my energy, Travis cried. What is? The fucking star? Listen to yourself, man, Eric barked. Travis diverted from his dead stare into the night sky to shoot a mad glare Eric's way, complete with glassy, roving eyes. Look at that star and tell me it's ordinary. Eric looked again and was surprised to see that it was much brighter than before. It no longer took him a few seconds to reclaim its position in the sky, and he could swear that it was in a different place altogether, now nestled in the cradle of a different constellation, and it was strobing more violently now, robbing Eric of the blinks that he so sorely wanted to bring to this captivating stare, this established connection between him and the star that seemed to want to draw him in, pull him closer like the vacuum Travis had described. Eric managed to close his eyes, and when he looked again, the star was flashing a Christmas green. You see that, right? That's not fucking normal, Travis challenged. I mean, I've seen meteorites burn up with green light before. You think that's a fucking meteor? And now it was moving, appearing to grow in size until it was as big as any full moon on any normal, cloudless night. It is moving like a meteor, Eric said, but there was a quiver of doubt in his voice. As he spoke, he could feel the teeth rattle in his head, and the desert wind had stopped blowing across their campsite. The fire had stopped crackling. The sparks had stopped flaring. Everything had frozen except for them and the flames in the fire pit, which were slowly diminishing, the light growing ever dimmer. A crippling wave of fear overcame Eric, and it was so debilitating and heart-stopping that he could only describe it as something alien, something outside of himself that was hitting him like a tsunami, threatening to flood his lungs and carrying his rock-heavy body down to the deepest, blackest depths of the ocean. Eric was suddenly locked away in all that darkness, and he struggled to breathe, thrashing in his invisible current on his fight for life to the water's surface. It's in my head, Travis screamed. He cocked his head and lined up his sight with the ball of light in the sky, now rushing down on them like the comet it pretended to be, suddenly flashing orange, red, purple, and blue. Eric didn't even hear the gunshot as Travis unloaded his chamber into the night sky. He was too busy staring with mad fascination as the light shined its aggressive spotlight down on them, and only on them. The radiation of its light cut through their clothes. Their skin, tapping uncomfortably with the marrow of their bones. And Eric screamed with all of his life force inside his mind as its rainbow-colored radiance whitewashed his senses, separating his consciousness from his body. The fireworks! He heard Travis yell, and then he felt the explosive waves of heat from the exploding canisters of gunpowder as they ricocheted off his body and plucked at his eardrums. But still he didn't hear them, only his own childlike screaming as the light consumed the sky, spreading wings blacker than the night to cast unholy shade across their campsite. But the light from Travis's fireworks overpowered the rainbow strobe of the alien orb bearing down upon them, and they both watched it shrink back until it was the size of a basketball held up at arm's length above their heads, just above the reach of the fireworks' blooming flower. Eric snapped out of his spell to watch Travis as he lit the fuse of the final firework and retreated a few steps with his palms clasped to his ears, and to watch the final colorful explosion light up the sky. But even before the last trickles of sparks had rained down from the spent explosion, the orb was magnifying again, snuffing out the rest of their campfire, and returning to cast its odd, black-light luminance on their surroundings. They were defenseless now, with all their guns and fireworks proving powerless, and both Eric and Travis knew enough not to look up into the sky as the orb closed the distance between them. They only locked fearful eyes and said their last silent goodbye. But Eric registered Travis's covered ears for the first time and thought quickly, screaming at Travis to get his phone out and play his music. Travis seemed to understand what he was getting at before Eric had even finished vocalizing his final plea. He whipped out his phone and had his black metal music blaring at full volume from his phone's tinny speakers. and they watched as the light instantly swung away from them, bathing them in darkness again. And when they looked up from their coward positions on their knees, clutching each other's shoulders, the orb of light was no longer basketball-sized, but the size of a dime, streaking across the sky and over the mountain until it was out of sight or overpowered by the other stars' twinkling radiance. And then they celebrated and danced in the music's heavy reverberations, and never before had Eric been so thankful to hear his friend's ear-splitting devil music. They spent the rest of the sleepless night clutching their loaded guns and taking turns holding up Travis's screaming, vibrating phone into the still night. And then dawn broke over the razor-sharp desert horizon, and Travis's phone threatened to die with 20% battery remaining. They packed up their things and hurried like they'd never hurried before, up the trail and back to their cars, keeping their heads down and their heavy metal bumping until they were safe in the parking lot. There they re-entered civilization and basked in the irritable scrutinization of the early morning hikers just arriving, and suddenly annoyed with the unsettled, unkempt energy of the teens, who had nothing better to do than defy the perfect sanctity of nature with their raucous totem of rock and roll. Tune in next time for another episode of Red Cave Podcast. Until then, guard your soul.